It's a pleasure for me to be here and have a chance to talk about the work of Hans Crombag and Willem Wagenaar, whom I've known for a very long time. Well, it was really the 30s and 40s that brought us these two amazing psychologists who contributed so much to the area of psychology and law. And it was very interesting for me to hear the interview with Harald and Hans. And I learned a lot about some of the other books that I haven't had a chance to read because sadly I only can read English. But in any event, what I decided that I should do, because for people who don't know, I study memory within the field of cognitive psychology. My field is human memory, and I have specialized in the subject of false memories. So I thought, because we have so many speakers and they've done so much work in the psychology law intersection, that I would focus just on the work on memory. And it was a bit of a dilemma for me because I wasn't quite sure whether, in 40 minutes or so, how much I should spend talking about their work, or was I supposed to talk about my work? I sought some advice from some experts in the Netherlands and was told, please do a little of both. So I hope you don't mind the parts where I'm talking about myself. I realize this is not about me, but sometimes I can't help it. So the subject of memory, which is so important to the law, is actually a subject that is important to everyone, whether you care about the law or not. Without memory, we wouldn't know how to wake up in the morning and make the toast, or find our car keys, or get ourselves to school or work. We need memory to be able to share experiences that are wonderful that we've had in the past, and even sometimes to think about experiences that are very sad. I recently read an article in the New Scientist that began with such a beautiful description of the importance of memory, much more eloquent than anything I could have written myself. So I thought I would share it with you. This is just from a month ago. Memory, perhaps the only thing that links the you sitting here today and the many yous from every previous day of your existence. Without memory, your relationships would mean nothing, not to mention your knowledge, tastes, and your many adventures. It might be no exaggeration to say that your memories are the essence of you. So we who study memory think we're studying something pretty fundamental and important. But there are fresh reasons, and even not so fresh reasons, to suggest that maybe we shouldn't always believe our own memories. I will often begin a talk by asking the audience, do you think I could make you remember? Could I make you remember, if it didn't happen, could I make you remember when you were a child, you saw a cat stuck in a tree and you rescued that cat? Could I make you remember that? Could I make you remember that you were attacked by a vicious animal if it never happened? Could I make you remember that when you were a teenager you committed a crime and it was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate? Could I make you remember that you saw filmed footage of a plane crashing into an apartment building in Amsterdam? If you didn't see that, could I make you remember that? Could I pour these things into your mind and make you have these memories? Many times if you ask people, especially lay people, I don't think I could ever be made to remember that I was attacked by an animal. if it didn't happen. I couldn't be made to remember that I saw a plane crash into an apartment building if it didn't happen. But we'll see how you feel in another half hour or so. So I want to start by talking about this bit of work, which is now known as the crashing memories paradigm. And this is a piece of work that Hans is the first author of, and he collaborated with Willem Wagenaar and also Peter van Koppen. And what this crashing memory paradigm is all about is this. Some people in this room may remember an important event that happened in the Netherlands. It was 1992 when a plane crashed into an apartment building. 43 people were killed in that accident, 11 were seriously injured. There were a number of people with minor injuries, and hundreds of people were left homeless. A politician referred to this as a disaster that has shaken the whole country. Well, this group of researchers, we'll call it the Crombag group, as he was the lead author of this work, 10 months later interviewed citizens in the Netherlands about their memories of this accident. And there was a question that was asked that insinuated that there was footage, that there was filmed footage of the plane actually crashing into the apartment building. Did you see the TV film of the moment the plane hit the apartment building? In their first study, more than half of their subjects said yes, they saw footage which did not exist. And the researchers pressed them for any details or any memories that they might have had about this footage that they were claiming they remembered but that they couldn't have because it didn't exist. And of those who said, yes, I saw it, 59 said the fire started immediately upon impact. 23% said the fire took some time. 18% didn't remember. These individuals had all kinds of memories of whether the plane, hit the building in a kind of vertical direction, or did it hit the building in a horizontal direction. They had details for these memories of things that didn't happen. There was a second study in this paper that was similar and showed even higher rates of false memories. The paper was published, and it has since had a tremendous impact all over the world. And so in other parts of the world, people have done their own version of a crashing memory study. So in Britain, a paper published in 1997 asked people whether they'd seen the footage of the crash in the tunnel that killed Princess Diana. And just as Crombag and colleagues had discovered earlier in their original crashing memory study, many people fell for this subtle suggestion in the question that the footage actually existed when it didn't, and many of them went on to give details about their recollection. Another crashing memory study had to do with the assassination of the Dutch politician. Same kind of thing. People claiming to have memories after a subtle suggestion that footage existed when, in fact, they couldn't have. It's interesting. Where do these memories come from? And with my graduate students, we also, following in the footsteps of Crombag and et al., did a crashing memory study and recently showed that people would claim to remember seeing footage of the plane that crashed in the field in Pennsylvania, one of those crashing planes that occurred on 9/11.
I remember it was in Yes.
The study is from 2011.
Yeah, I actually, thank you for, now I'm just trying to remember whether why that says 2011, whether we did the study, whether we published the first crashing memory study in 2011, but yes, our 9/11 was 2001. That's when this non-existent footage was being remembered by our subjects. So I really show these other examples just to show you that in different parts of the world, people are doing these crashing memory studies and finding that ordinary, healthy, otherwise, normal human beings, and so many of them are so easily able to believe that they have memories and to give you all kinds of details of things that they couldn't have possibly seen. This was an innovative way of studying false memories. It was different from the usual way that I study false memories. And there are a number of questions that you can ask about their paradigm, the crashing memory paradigm, and the other paradigms that were being used in false memory research. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about some of those other paradigms, and then I'll ask a question about all of these paradigms. So in my own work, we more typically used a misinformation paradigm. So in a misinformation paradigm, people get some kind of event that they have to experience. It's a simulated crime or a simulated accident. And later on, we're going to supply them with some post-event information, some misleading information of some sort, and then we'll test people to see what it is they remember about the accident or about the crime that they have been exposed to earlier. And so, for example, we showed people simulated accidents, and then we might expose them to misleading details about the accident, and then we would test them to see what they themselves personally remember. In one very old study that I did in the beginning of this line of work, we showed people a simulated accident where a car goes through an intersection with a stop sign, and by asking a single leading question, did another car pass the red dots, and while it was there at the intersection with the yield sign, we can get lots and lots of people to believe and remember they saw a yield sign at the accident, not a stop sign. These studies got criticized, so we would often hear, okay, these are simulated accidents, these are not real events. Maybe if somebody saw a real accident or a real shooting of some sort, it would be so emotional and arousing that these same kinds of memory errors would not occur. That's a decent criticism of the work, but one response to it is, let's go out and study people who are undergoing extremely arousing or upsetting experiences. I've had a chance to do that recently in some work where we're studying soldiers in America who are going to survival school. They are learning what it's going to be like for them if they're ever captured as prisoners of war. And it's an extremely arousing, upsetting experience, this survival school. They're obviously undergoing this experience for a good reason. And as part of the survival school, these soldiers, they get a 30-minute aggressive, hostile, upsetting interrogation. And afterwards, we expose these soldiers to misleading information, misinformation about who conducted that arousing, upsetting interrogation. And we get lots and lots of people to misremember their interrogator. So they may have seen the guy on the left doing the interrogation for a half hour, But after suggestive misinformation, we get many of them to believe and remember they saw the guy on the right. An example of misinformation. And so now I've summarized about 40 years of work on the misinformation effect, some of which I did with Willem Wagenaar. And what you see here is just a simple graph. If you mislead people, if you put people in a misled condition, it depresses their memory performance. They pick up on the information, incorporate it into their memory, and it causes an alteration, distortion, contamination in the memory. This is important to the legal system because out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation when we talk to other people about an event that we might have jointly seen. We get misinformation if we are interrogated by an investigator who's got an agenda and communicates information even inadvertently. We get misinformation when we're exposed to media coverage. Maybe we've seen a high publicity event and then we watch other people be interviewed on television, in the newspaper, whatever. All of these provide an opportunity for misinformation to enter a person's conscious awareness and cause a distortion or contamination in memory. In the interview with Hans, there was an allusion to an even more extreme kind of memory problem, one that invaded the United States, invaded the Netherlands, invaded other parts of Europe, invaded Australia and New Zealand. And I'm talking about these claims of repressed memory. People coming forward and saying, you know, I've gone through some therapy, and now, after this therapy, I realized something that I never knew before. That for 10 years, my father raped me. He raped me in satanic rituals sometime. He forced me into these rituals where I had to endure animal sacrifice, baby breeding, baby sacrifice, the works. All of these memories allegedly repressed into the unconscious until the therapy made the patient aware of these experiences. One of the famous cases in the Netherlands involved a woman named Yolanda. When I started to see these cases in the United States, and I had many discussions with Willem especially about these kinds of cases, I mean, they were extremely disturbing cases, as was alluded to in the interview with Hans. I mean, families were being destroyed, false accusations were creating havoc everywhere. And so how do these kind of false memories develop? This was not turning a stop sign into a yield sign. This was not making people believe that, you know, perpetrator A was really perpetrator B. But these individuals were developing something really big. These are really, really rich false memories. And we needed a new way of studying this. The misinformation paradigm, you know, was not really going to cut it. The crashing memory paradigm was, you know, in its infancy at that point. And so we would develop a new idea, which is what we're now calling the rich false memory paradigm. What happens in this research is there's no event to begin with, but we just ply people with suggestions about the past, and then we test them to see what they remember about their childhood or about their more recent past. So how are you going to do this? What are we going to plant in the minds of people? What rich false memory? As many people here, I'm sure, are aware, I don't know all the rules for doing human subjects research in the Netherlands, but at least in the parts of the world where I live, if you want to do a study involving human beings, you've got to get permission from an ethics committee or a human subjects review committee. You can't, even in the name of science, just go out there and do whatever you want with people. So it didn't seem too likely that our ethics committee would look too kindly on a proposal that we're going to take women and we're going to make them believe that they were raped in a satanic ritual by their father. I mean, these committees are not likely to, it would make them squeamish. So you need some kind of analog. Maybe we could plant something that would, if it had happened, would be at least mildly traumatic and would not so offend our ethics committees that they wouldn't give us permission to do it. And so the first study that we did involved suggesting to people that when they were a kid, they were lost in a shopping mall, they were frightened and crying, ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And we succeeded in getting about a quarter, not the 55% that I showed you from the crashing memory study, but about a quarter of ordinary men and women to fall for a suggestion after 3 suggestive interviews that they were lost in a shopping mall in this particular way. Study got criticized. You know, getting lost is so common. Well, show us if you want to talk about this on the same page as you're going to be talking about Yolanda accusing people of delayed memory sex abuse. Show us you can plan a false memory for something that would be more upsetting or arousing or bizarre if it had actually happened. Other people came along and responded to this challenge. One group in Tennessee planted a false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, succeeding with about 1/3 of their sample. A group in Canada planted a false memory that something as terrible as being attacked by a vicious animal happened in your childhood. They're getting really good, almost as good as the crashing memory figure, because they succeeded with about half of their sample to get a partial or complete false memory. I collaborated with an Italian collaborator, and in Italian subjects we planted a false memory that when you were a kid you witnessed a person being demonically possessed. And a more recent study, this also done in Canada, planting a false memory when you were a teenager, you committed a crime, and it was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate. This study showed, and when it was published in Psychological Science, one of our top journals, they reported that they succeeded with 70% of their sample. There was a group of investigators that came along even more recently and said, this 70% figure, that is so huge, we want to see your data. And they actually got the protocols from the Canada study, the committing a crime study. They reanalyzed those protocols using a more conservative method of reanalysis. And they claim that the figure is closer to 30%, developing a false memory of committing a crime yourself as a teenager. And my reaction to that is, you know, if you can even do something in a short period of time that gets 30% of people to start admitting to a crime they didn't do that was completely made up by the investigators, that's still pretty impressive. There was a mega-analysis recently of these rich false memory studies. It was published by a group, they're Canadian, from Britain and from the US. They took all these protocols from these rich false memory studies and tried to analyze them using a common coding scheme and answer the question, how often are people falling for this after just a few suggestive interviews? Their answer, with 423 subjects who endured these suggestive interventions, they got false memories in about 30% of their sample, and an additional 23% developed a belief that this had happened, even if they didn't go so far as to have this feeling of recollection. That belief is important because we think developing a false belief is often the first step down that royal road to getting a false memory. So now we can ask an interesting question about the crashing memory study of Crombag and colleagues, and these other paradigms, like the misinformation false memories, turning the stop sign into a yield sign, or the rich false memories, like getting people to believe they were attacked by an animal when it didn't happen. And a number of investigators have recently asked this question: is there something like a false memory trait? If you are prone to develop a false memory in one kind of paradigm, like the crashing memory paradigm, are you also someone who's prone to develop a false memory in one of these other paradigms? And the simplest answer is basically no. That the correlations between are very small, and sometimes so close to zero as to be basically non-existent, that it's not the same people who are falling for a false memory in these different paradigms. And I see a whole lot more, I can see a future with a lot more work trying to tease apart what's going on in the human mind when people develop these different kinds of false memories. Yeah. So I now want to turn to Willem Wagenaar, whom I've probably had many more interactions with over what I now know is at least the last 35 years or more. And one of the studies that isn't talked about very much, and maybe doesn't relate to the law so much, but was really important in the field of memory, is a study that Willem did, and he published it in 1986 in one of the top journals in our field, Cognitive Psychology, and you can see the title of his paper is My Memory. And what he did is to record his memories over a 6-year period. He would write down experiences over a 6-year period of his life, and then he would have someone test him to see what it is he could remember. It was an incredibly innovative piece of work. There was one person who had done something a little vaguely similar, Marigold Linton, a few years before, but not nearly as elegantly and beautifully as this study. There's a figure in this paper that shows you in his handwriting the a sample event. What does he write down? And you maybe can't read this, and I'm sure did all his recordings in Dutch, and he's publishing in an English language journal, so he's translated one of his entries into English. But this is what Willem was doing on September 10th, 1983. He was going to see the Last Supper. He was in a church in Milan. He's rated the experience. It's not too emotional for him. On a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is nothing, no emotion, and 5 is extreme emotion, he gives it a 1. He says it's somewhat pleasant. On a scale from very unpleasant to extremely pleasant, he gives it basically a 5. That was the 7-point scale. Who was with him? I love this because it says Beth Loftus and Jim Reason, a British psychologist. We were at a convention near Milan, and we went to see the Last Supper. So that's how I know that I knew Willem at least since 1983. But we had many, well, first I should tell you a little bit about some of his findings, because the paper is full of interesting findings, and we don't have time for all of them now, but he reported that pleasant events were recalled better than unpleasant ones. Well, what would happen is his research assistant would test him at various points in time later and would give him either one clue or two clues, maybe the date in which something happened or who was there, some kind of clue, and he would then have to try to recall the event. So he found that pleasant events were better recalled when he was tested than unpleasant ones, and that the probability of remembering an event depended on the number of clues that he had been given. He reported, I found this kind of fascinating, that there were 10 events that seemed to be completely forgotten. He just couldn't get them back, even when he had all the clues. Well, is anything ever forgotten? What Willem did is to interview people about the ones who were there during those forgotten memories. And he found in each and every one of those 10 cases, the people he went to talk to, they were able to get him to remember these events. And so he reported in this paper that no event was completely forgotten. I had another extensive bit of interaction with Willem over a highly significant case, court case. This was the case of John Demjanjuk, who was being tried in Jerusalem for crimes against humanity. He was accused of being the operator of the gas chamber at the Treblinka concentration camp during World War II. He had been extradited from the United States, where he had lived for a long time, to stand trial in Jerusalem. And I was contacted by Demjanjuk's attorney, asked whether I would be an expert witness and talk about 35-year-old memories and how much can you trust them, and the methods of identification that were used to elicit the identification of Demjanjuk. And it was a very, very difficult decision for me. Being Jewish, having my 90-year-old uncle say, please don't let this be the last thing you do before I die. Spending 6 months trying to convince myself either that Demjanjuk is innocent and then I'll just have to say to my uncle I have to do this, or that Demjanjuk was guilty, in which case maybe I don't want to participate. I just didn't know what to do. It seemed like the scientists should say, yes, of course I'll go and I'll tell you what the science has to say. But the little Jewish girl with 4 Jewish grandparents, that part of me was having great difficulty. It seemed like the consistent thing to do would be go do it, but I was having so much trouble. And then one day, I had a friend came over for tea, and I was describing this dilemma about, do I get involved in this case? Do I not? What do I do? And I said it seems the consistent thing to do would be to do it, but something is so troubling me. And my friend said, quoting Ralph Waldo Emerson, he said, consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And I just said to myself, you know, I don't need to be consistent. Who says you have to be consistent in life? And I came to a solution that I think was the best solution for me, for Demjanjuk, and hopefully for Willem Wagenaar, because I brought them together, and he became the expert witness in Jerusalem. I went to Jerusalem to watch his testimony. I'd been, so kind of involved in studying the situation for so long. And here you see a session where Willem and his wife Margaret are kind of strategizing with Demjanjek's attorney in a hotel in Jerusalem the day before Willem would actually testify in the trial. There was also a little time for some sightseeing. And afterwards, Willem wrote a tremendous book about his experience called Identifying Ivan, which was a case analysis of this particular case. You may or may not know or care about the outcome. Demjanjek was convicted in that court case in Jerusalem. And then later, with the fall of the Soviet Union, new information came out that suggested that he was innocent, that another man, Ivan Marchenko, was really the Ivan the Terrible who had operated that gas chamber. And so Demjanjek was then freed. But that's another story for another time. I also I'm very honored to have, while Willem was the rector at Leiden, I received an honorary doctorate from Leiden, so I got to sign that same wall after that Einstein signed and that all other students signed. And there is a picture of us as we are heading off to the ceremony. There also was some celebrating. I know, and there was some kind of dinner afterwards, and there's Willem's daughter, Elizabeth, who's sitting in the front row. You know, your hair's a different color now, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't die.
And is that his mother? Is that your grandmother?
Yeah, but it's
Oh, that's your mother. Okay, that's Margaret's mother, and then Barbara,
Yeah.
the other daughter, is next to them. So I pulled these out of my scrapbook. I think I have time for
10 minutes.
Okay, one more story for you,
Yes.
and a bit more research, and to tell you something very embarrassing, but I'm going to do it. Before I tell you this, I have to tell you about some recent work, and my advisors told me, like, be sure you tell us something recent, on something that we're now calling memory blindness. It's a little different than the typical sort of misinformation, that strong misinformation you get in the misinformation effect, or sort of more subtle misinformation that you get in a crashing memory kind of paradigm. Here, people are going to be given misinformation about their prior response. So they, for example, might see a thief take a wallet out of a woman's purse and stick it into his green jacket. This is a scene from the crime scene that the witnesses saw. Later on, when they're asked to remember the jacket color that the thief was wearing, many of them will accurately identify it as a green jacket. But sometime later, you can go back to them and you can tell them they gave an answer that's different from the one they actually gave. And so here's how you might do that. Here's how we did it in this initial work. Earlier you said the thief's jacket was this color, pointing to kind of a brown. We now want you to answer this question: what was the brand of the jacket? And so you're busy as a witness thinking about the brand. I've just suggested to you that your earlier response was brown and not green. What happens? Many subjects don't even detect that that's not what they previously said, and their memory shifts in the direction of this new false assertion. That's memory blindness. The latest work that we've done on memory blindness, and I'm going to tell you about the dissertation work that from this year of my graduate student, Kevin Cochran, who had the pleasure of visiting the Maastricht group, because there's some inspiration in his work that you will see from the group in Maastricht, Harald, Henry, and others. And here's the newest bit of work on memory blindness. In Kevin's dissertation, the subjects are going to undergo a very painful experience, and then they'll rate their pain, and they'll then be given misinformation about their prior rating. So, for example, they stick their hand in cold ice water for 90 seconds. It's 4 centigrades. If they can make it to 90 seconds, then they have to rate their pain on a 100-point scale. Let's say they give it an 80. It was really painful. I'm giving it an 80 on this 100-point scale. But now we give them false information about their prior response. Earlier, you told us that this pain for you was a 60. Why did you rate it that way? Why did you rate it a 60? In other words, it's false information about their prior response. They didn't say 60, they said 80. What do they do after you say that to them? Do they even detect? Well, only 11% showed any signs of concurrent detection at all. Almost everybody showed no sign whatsoever that they detected that this was not the answer they'd previously given. If you probe them in more detail later on, was there anything strange about how the computer reminded you of your pain rating? We call this retrospective detection, and only 33% showed any sign of detecting this. Now what happened to their memory for this painful experience? It's 1 or 2 days later. They have to tell us what their memory is for the pain they experienced at the time they had their hand in the water. And I'll just walk you through this. If we fed them false information, told them they had said 60 when they really said 80, they remember their pain as less. And there is some evidence, a marginally significant 0.07 result, that they're more willing to participate in another study like this if they have fallen for this misinformation about their painful response. And so what we're showing here is something that we call memory blindness, that people are getting this misinformation about their own earlier reports. They're not detecting that it's happening, and it then influences how they think they felt, how they think they remembered, and so on. I've mostly been thinking about this in terms of police statements. You know, witness goes to the police station after witnessing a crime. Maybe the officer writes something out and says, okay, here's what you told me. Just look this over and sign it at the bottom. But what if it has errors? This memory blindness work suggests that people may often not detect the errors and then fall for the information. I think it has some relevance to fact-checking. It often happens that if I get interviewed by, let's say, a magazine journalist, that someone from the magazine will later on call me and say, here's what you told our journalist who interviewed you 3 weeks ago. We're just checking to make sure everything's okay. Well, what if there are errors? Am I even going to notice? And if I don't notice, am I going to fall now for that error in that kind of setting? And now I bring you to my confession of embarrassing example. Leading up to this example, I will say that I didn't know that Harald was going to be showing a slide of the co-authored book by Willem and Hans, The Popular Policeman. It's really a great book. It's about, as Harald said in his interview of Hans, it's about their involvement in some actual cases or their unique analyses of some other cases that they might not have been specifically involved in, and where the psychological science plays a role. And I had a chance to review the book And, you know, I'm a blurber here for this book. And here's my blurb. I said, Wagenaar and Crombag display eloquence as writers, and their flair for narrative combined with faithfulness to science makes this book a remarkable work on psychology and law. Okay, that's what happened with their book. Now here's my book. And in this book, Witness for the Defense, I have a chapter on the Demjanje case and my interactions with Willem and his family and some of our interactions in Jerusalem while he was testifying as an expert witness. And Willem reviewed my book, Witness for the Defense, for a publication. And so here we are quoting from the book. Willem and Margaret live in Denmark. They have 4 beautiful children, 2 boys and 2 girls. I visited them once. I remember watching the family gathered together by a piano, the children in their pajamas as each one took their turn to play. That's in my book. That's in my book. My co-authored book with my co-author, Kathy Ketchum. Well, here's what Willem had to say. Well, she visited 3 times, but in the Netherlands, where I've lived for the last 50 years, not Denmark. I have 4 children, and I will not quibble about their beauty. But none of them plays the piano, nor do I. And he goes on to question my memory. He says, are these memory errors memory distortions? Did she confuse us with a Danish family? Did she change the concert at which my wife accompanied me on the piano into a family scene in pajamas? Is this hearsay evidence flawed in the memory of her co-author? We may never know. I wish he were here, because I think I do know. I was a victim of memory blindness. I told my stories and showed my documents and spent hours and hours with my co-author. My co-author, Kathy Ketchum, on the book Witness for the Defense, is a remarkable woman. She was my secretary for many years. She used to type my papers before we had computers, and that would be submitted for publication. And she went on to become a fantastic mass market writer. So, well, I'm an okay science writer. She is the one who knows how to write in, strangled in her own pantyhose. Her body was found at the floor of the fireplace, I mean, the kind of writing that I just can't do. So Ketchum and I got together and for this book. She's gone on to be a fantastic writer, and she teams up with people and she helps to tell their nonfiction story. So I'm telling her the stories of these cases, showing her the documents, but I then do a little bit of the writing and I also review everything. So she must have sent this back to me, and I'm reading it. And I knew it was the Netherlands, but I don't know how it became Denmark. And then I didn't even stop it from happening. Here are Willem's final words in that review. These strange anomalies provide the best possible justification for putting memory on trial. So I'm going to leave us with Willem's words as the final words, and just say that it's really been an honor for me to be here and have a chance to participate in this celebration of these 2 great lives and work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.